welcome everybody to our May Master Teacher Professional Development. So it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Pam Kirkland. She is a Master Teacher at UTeach Dallas, where she teaches Step 1 and Step 2. She is also the Induction Specialist. She received her certification in 2020 on Social, Emotional, and Character Development through a program at Rutgers and has been working on incorporating SEL skills into STEM lessons. And today she's going to be sharing with us a fantastic presentation. I cannot wait on communication, how to improve communication. So Pam, whenever you are ready, feel free to take it away.
Well, hi everyone, and thanks for joining today. And this is just, we're going to have just a good discussion on some ways to basically encourage our pre-service and our in-service teachers. And thank you so much, Elizabeth, for putting together all the MTPDs this semester. They have been wonderful. I've learned so much. And I mean, everyone, Kenneth, yours was just one nugget after the next. So thank you so much. And Elizabeth, yours was. Matter of fact, I'll be referring to some of your sessions today. So thank you. And this topic, I don't claim to be an expert on every part of it by any means. And it's very broad and it's very deep. And it's definitely, if this sparks someone's interest, we'd love to have continued conversation about this and learn more from one another. So that's kind of where we're at. Basically, when I was looking at this topic, the overarching goal really is helping create a growth mindset in how we communicate with others, focusing on becoming aware of some of the brain processes involved in face-to-face communication, such as conversation and discussions, as well as reflecting on some of the foundational social emotional skills that may help in effective communication. And so that's kind of where we went with this. We're actually been working a lot on this topic at UT Dallas, particularly in our Step 1 class. And of course, I've been implementing more social emotional training and topics and objectives with our induction. So it's very much in growth. And when we kind of look at this as a journey, basically, it started pretty much in 2016, 2017, where Emily Hennessy and we started getting a lot of cooperative learning training. We had both been K through 12 teachers. I had read a lot of Kagan, but to actually get a deep dive into cooperative learning and to really understand all the layers involved, it was really great. Like one of the presenters, he had a whole school that was cooperative learning based and did it and really talked about the strengths to it and how to get it started. And after we went through all this training, we kept coming back to, we were asked to train teachers. And one argument a lot of the teachers had is they support cooperative learning, but they felt like their students, it wasn't the academic skills, it was the social skills, what they called the soft skills, that a lot of the students didn't have to work collaboratively together in either in cooperative learning, which is more teacher structured in a way. And they said definitely in collaborative learning, which was kind of interesting. And so we started looking into that more, and we actually did a book study, which is a great book. I mean, it's big, it's thick, but it has some points that you might just be able to skim over because it talks about different types of SEL programs. But myself, Dr. McConnell, Emily did a book study on the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning. And from that, we learned a lot about implementing SEL in higher education and like the Aspen Institute, which was a great resource, and different resources about higher education. We actually got a grant, an award, Centers for Teaching and Learning in 2019. And in Step 1 at UT Dallas, Katie Donaldson worked actually in coordinating our Step 1 classes with freshman classes to help with recruiting. And so in those classes that are required by UT Dallas, we actually trained the student leaders in cooperative learning. And then we provided activities on social emotional learning for the students. And we had 6 different activities they did, and it really seemed to be very beneficial. We received a lot of feedback from that. Then we started implementing social emotional skills and incorporating that into the Step 1 program in 2020. That's when I also got my certification. And currently we've been doing things with TeachingWorks, and we're working a lot on effective communication. So we're kind of building up on that. And this past year, I've been very fortunate because I've been able to go back out and have one-on-one interaction with our graduates again. I used to do campus visits. I teach step 1, step 2, and I do induction. I also do step 1 scheduling. So a lot of other things, but and so the opportunity to kind of get to go out and see my graduates is always fun. And what I noticed, and what I've noticed from step 1 observations made, as well as the discussions with our graduates, is that they were noticing that their students were struggling communicating. They can put them in groups, they can try to encourage them to work together, but it wasn't happening. They said, they'll literally be totally silent working together. They'll give each other the answer, but that's it. There was no really, as Creation for ESL talks about, there was no basic intercommunication skills. And think of how difficult that is for if an ESL student is in the class and that just general conversation isn't happening. That's a real challenge if we want students to learn English, let alone our students that just English may be their primary language, but that whole supported system wasn't there. They also noticed that really that support system wasn't necessarily there for between teachers, that, we put teachers in PLCs, we asked them to work together and to collaborate on lesson planning, but when some of that communication isn't happening, what goes on? So with that, 3 driving questions sort of came to mind. And it was, when in K through 12 would students have learned effective face-to-face communication with their peers? Because we're expecting that in step 1. They're going to have to collaborate with one another. They're going to actually have to produce a product that they're going to go out and teach to students. And then looking at our graduates, how prepared are our new graduates to deal with face-to-face communication with students? And we're not talking about open-ended questions and eliciting student responses like Katie talked about. We're talking about just interacting with one another, being able to communicate and form that kind of safe community before they take academic risks. And colleagues, how well do they feel? I mean, our UTeach students go from a very cohesive teams that understand how the UTeach program works, and then they go out to work in schools that they haven't had UTeach training. They may be their same age and they may have gone through a different teaching program with different concepts and different views, but we're expecting them all to work together. The same as administrators. One thing I found when I actually was getting my social emotional character development training, SECD, I had to do a practicum for the entire semester. So we were practicing on SEL activities, incorporating them into the context of step 1 focus, as well as asking lots of questions. I did a midterm evaluation, a final on certain skills. And one skill all the students said they did not feel comfortable with was feedback. They said they didn't see it as a support system. They saw it as somebody judging them, and they saw it as criticism. And they said, in turn, they don't feel comfortable giving it back. And since then, we've kind of changed the way we ask students about feedback. And we have a form, but we actually have sentence stems, and we really preface it a lot now, so they see it as a growth concept. But think of what kind of feedback they're going to have to get from administrators. And then lastly, parents. I had an administrator tell me when I was getting my administrator certification that one area he felt like he was not very successful in is really letting parents know that he understood how they felt. He may not be able to relate completely to what they're going through. He said, but I don't think my empathy was really noticed. And again, how often are we talking to our students about that? Because they're going to be working with parents. And lastly, how much training is provided to educators by districts on the basics of effective face-to-face communication? So kind of looking at our program as a whole, we're excellent with the 21st century skills, particularly thinking critically and creative thinking. And when, we address that a lot in the 5E, and we talk a lot about that, and teachers, our open-ended questioning and the way we encourage, the students to interact and be actively involved in an activity and problem solving. But most of those skills are very individual. A student learns to individually think creatively. They think individually to think critically. The other 2 C's involve 2 people coming together that may be very different. They may have different strengths. They may think creatively, but very differently. They may think critically, but very differently. And now they're having to work together. And the key to collaboration is having good communication skills. And so these were kind of some that we really started thinking about when we start talking about cooperative learning, when we talk about project-based instruction and so forth. And the underlying social emotional skills really are self-awareness, social awareness, relationship skills, responsible decision-making. And attached to this Nearpod, and I put the code there, and I did a Nearpod. Don't look at 44 screens and go, oh my gosh, I love resources. So I provided a ton of resources for you all just to look at whenever you want. But one is a Harvard graduate school website, and it compares all the different educational frameworks. And one is on 21st century skills, and it even compares it against the CASEL framework. And as a K through 12 teacher, when you said 21st century skills, the only thing I thought about was the 4 C's. That's it. That's what I focused on all the time. Campus improvement plans have that. District improvement plans have that. When in fact, 30% of the 21st century skills framework is that. 26% are social emotional skills and life skills that ultimately students need for college and career readiness. So it's not that we're talking about something that doesn't need to be is an extra above, but can be incorporated into lesson plans. So here's the resources right here. And I also included the CASEL competencies. I really like the one from the Arizona Department of Education because you can actually see it. It wasn't fuzzy. So kind of, since we can just we don't have to put it on the Collaborate board, we can just talk. So how well do have educators been provided, in your opinion, from your experiences? Do you feel like they've been provided a full picture of the 21st century skills? I mean, have they ever really had a deep dive into it, or is it just something kind of like an acronym we kind of touch on and we move on?
I think it's pretty well glossed over. If you want to know the truth, you know, it's projected in something somewhere and talked about for about 5 minutes, and then we move on. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think especially among university professors, I mean, it's been alluded to sometimes here as those global skills, and you get a lot of resistance. So I'm here to teach content. I'm not here to teach people how to communicate and get along and problem solve. They're supposed to already know all of those things. So.
Great. And, and it's just the studies are showing that too, in the last month, I was telling Elizabeth, I've seen so many articles about retention for educators. And a big part is not them, like I was part of the campus improvement team, district improvement teams, doing all that. And I was always the one coming to the teachers, telling them what the district is going to be doing, what the campus is going to be doing. And now they're really coming to realize teachers have to have ownership. They should be in these committees. They should be making those decisions. So again, thinking about that and that ownership and that bond with other teachers, that even when they're facing challenges, they can model these skills that in turn the studies show if they are actively modeling this in their own interactions with their peers and colleagues, they're going to in turn just carry that type of mindset into the classroom and ultimately model it for students as well. So if we're just talking about face-to-face communication, just the basic textbook is face-to-face communication refers to the interaction between 2 or more people where all are in direct contact with each other. During the interaction, individuals are transmitting information, including thoughts, ideas, emotions, and a common understanding between the participants. And I put this, but then I kind of laughed because I thought that's probably what a lot of my SIP 1 students coming in just think, this is how it works, And I just kind of chuckled because I thought, oh, okay, this is going to be, usually when you tell them all these things, they're like, it'll probably be different. And then by the time they teach their first lesson, oh, yeah, okay. Another basic textbook version of what face-to-face interaction even involves. It involves a sender and a receiver. The sender mentally pulls together, often quickly, a collection of words will identify what the speaker is thinking, assembles the words into a recognizable order in the speaker's mind, verbally shares the mental words using verbal sounds that's assumed will be recognized by the listener. There's a big one, and transmits a set of nonverbal gestures, hand gestures, movement, their voice going up and down, intonation to the listener. Okay, the listener, again, Here's the sounds. This is, again, what the textbook view is. Here's the sounds from the speaker and decodes them, often quickly, into an intended meaning by the speaker. Avoids misinterpreting any words or unconscious nonverbal cues, translates verbal and nonverbal cues into a picture, assumed to be the picture the same as the speaker, and avoids distracting thoughts and beliefs. That is utopia. And so, and then there's the real world. So what may be some assumptions people make during face-to-face communication? Is there any that come to mind right away that might be something you've noticed, or particular like with our pre-service or our induction?
I think there's an assumption that the other person is actually listening. So you talk about active listening. Are they actually active listening? Or are they just kind of, waiting for their chance to talk? Or are they sort of thinking about something else? So are they really focusing in on what the other person is saying?
Yeah. And that, yes, that's a big one. And I mean, we're all guilty of it. It's not done intentionally necessarily. It just, your mind wanders. Well, here's some based on just some general information I've pulled from resources, from books I've read on communication, to I've been taking a course, great courses, and I've watched about 20 hours of videos and gotten lots of notes on communication. And these were some general assumptions. The assumption is both participants are fully engaged, open-minded, have the same meaning or context of words, are forming similar pictures in their minds during the conversation or discussion, and understand all nonverbal cues. Speaker, the listener is giving them full attention. Thoughts of the speaker are appreciated. So when the listening, but the speaker is saying things, and that the listener is just overjoyed with what they've got to share. The listener is thinking, I'm listening to you, okay? And the thoughts and opinions or comments that I'm sharing to the speaker are just well received and appreciated. In reality, the picture is being created in both participants' minds based on individual past experiences, maybe understanding and meaning of words chosen and nonverbal cues may be very different. Giving full mental attention at all times throughout the conversation may not be happening. Thoughts shared may not even be appreciated or understood by other participants. And lastly, both the speaker and listener may not be as open-minded as assumed, and may have some implicit biases each is completely unaware of. So when you think of all this going on, you're like, oh my goodness, how do we actually get the students to learn? How do we actually have a productive conversation with our peers? Well, Dr. Paul Watzlawick, I love that name, Pragmatics of Human Communication. Well, we're only going to focus really on one, but I think the other one kind of speaks for itself. It says one cannot not communicate. The other one says the relationship may impact the perceived intentions, actions, and way of communicating. Again, if somebody may disagree with you, but you have a very strong relationship with that person, you have a lot of respect for them, you may not take it to the same way as somebody that you really don't know, or maybe you've been, kind of more competitive in nature with. You may not receive that information or that feedback as well. But we're going to focus on this one. What do you think this axiom means or looks like between two people? One cannot not communicate. So what do you think that even means? I mean, what do you picture in your mind when you see that?
You're communicating whether you know it or not. Every little gesture you do, you roll your eyes, you take a breath, you look at your watch. Somebody may be thinking, oh, they're in a hurry or they're not listening, when in fact it might be your Apple Watch that's buzzing and telling you it's time to stand up, right?
I love that. Yeah, that's true. I mean, you're sitting there and somebody walks in. They're organized, they're quick, they've got everything. You just think they've got their act together. Okay, that person might be somebody I might talk to about things, or might be good for organizing. Somebody walks in a room and they've got their papers everywhere. They look frazzled. You're drawing conclusions about that might not be the best person to ask about organizing something, just from even though they haven't said two words to you.
And I think we don't always know what it is that we communicate. You can't not communicate, but sometimes what you communicate is not necessarily what you thought you were communicating.
Good point. Right. Exactly. So when you kind of look at this, when I saw this, I thought, oh, yeah. A teacher, a student walks in your classroom, they haven't said 2 words to you, but you just see that they're kind of loud, they're running around, just their physical, actions, you're drawing conclusions on, or maybe they're talking, or just different things that we're immediately, our brains going at it and starting to organize and sort information that may very much not be what it really is, which is what we're going to talk about here. Which a big part of effective communication is really being aware of our brain processing, and really becoming aware of these things is where the growth mindset starts to come in. And it's thinking about basically what is communication, and then thinking about what does it involve. And one involves communication is continually happening consciously and unconsciously. We take in information nonstop. So in order for us not to absolutely go crazy, we need a process to help us with system overload. We make inferences and form decisions quickly using limited data and rapid processing. What becomes an issue there is we start to generalize and make quick perceptions and conclusions based on extremely limited data. And we make first impressions of people and things. What we hear first may direct subsequent decision making. Like, well, I'm not sure how I feel about that. Immediately somebody goes this way, or wow, I'm thinking something very different, or no, that's not right. And you immediately start filtering out and start having different ideas and really don't let the person, or in your mind, you're not really listening to the rest of it. And what may happen due to fast processing of information is a big one. And this is where the mental processes involved really make us start thinking about, and this is why becoming aware of this is so important. And that's kind of what the foundation for a lot of the discussion is based on. And is the thing called the ladder of inference. And what it's basically saying is we all start with a pool of data. It's out there, we all have it. This is reality. I would almost say that the pool of data is basically reality. What's going on, what the discussion is about, what the issue may be, the classroom that you're in, the situation you're talking to a student about. And then you immediately start making observations. You're doing this unconsciously. You start pulling out. Now, I read an article that talked about the observations you make, again, are a lot based on, and you start making them based on prior experiences, okay? And a lot of your self-view and your self-talk, which Elizabeth talked a lot about in her January session, you start selecting that data immediately. Then you start deciding what's the meaning to that. When that person disagreed with me, what were they really trying to tell me? And you start putting meaning to things from the selected data you pulled. Again, not the full data, just the selected data. Then you go into assumptions. Well, they may be trying to tell me that really my ideas, I didn't really know what I was talking about, or I wasn't clear, or that really wasn't of value. And then you start drawing conclusions. I'm not being respected. I'm not being heard. That student is hard to work with. That peer is hard to work with. My administrator isn't respecting what I'm doing and doesn't see what I do every day. That parent is being closed-minded and not hearing about the tutoring that their student needed to go to. They're not hearing this. And then unfortunately, it starts going into beliefs. Well, again, that person doesn't really listen well. That person's not good to work with. The PLC team isn't being effective, that type of thing. The student has issues and really needs to, due to actions of the student, they're not being successful, and so on and so on. And ultimately, that's when you start to talk and take action. And that really, when you start, and this loop keeps going over and over again. And what they talked all about too is, and when you, let's say, interact with that person again, you take that first experience and start looping that in. So you've already had one loop that could be negative with someone, and then you continue that loop next time you see that person. And ultimately it leads to perceptions, a selective attention. Our mind can make things up. We just keep adding and adding and adding to it. It can lead to implicit bias, which, you know, an unconscious bias operates outside of the person's awareness. You know, it was kind of interesting. And actually, I pulled some of the screens off just not to make this too long so we could talk. But it also talked about that, again, our view of ourselves is that a lot of times, like, let's say I think I'm a very organized person. Okay. And then I'm in a meeting and somebody goes, well, it seems like you need to kind of think through this a little bit more, or maybe, you know, we need to kind of do a little bit more organizing of this. And immediately that goes out of your mind. That says, no, that's not the paradigm I have of myself. That's not how I view myself. So you're telling me something that I'm not even listening to, you know, because that's not how my preset thoughts on who I am and my self-value and my strengths. So you just kind of go through that. And it was just interesting on how this can limit our growth in so many areas. And of course, when you start having amygdala hijack, now you start getting stressed, you start getting irritated, you know, your cortisol level goes up, your adrenaline level goes up, and you are not listening. You know, you might be getting upset at the student, you might be getting upset at a peer, and ultimately you have a very ineffective conversation very quickly. And so that's something that really, but if we can really be thinking about this process, then we can definitely be more successful. And that's actually what this video, and I'm going to put it at all devices, and I'm hoping technology works like it should. Can everybody see this picture? Okay. Now let's hope you can hear it. I'm going to skip to where she begins, 518.
As it's staying grounded in evidence, we find that the ladder of inference is a really powerful model, because you see, we're always surrounded by this sort of a sea of data. And you can think of there being a ladder that lifts you out of all the data that's available and gets you to a place where you do something about it. So for example, you might have someone on your team who selects some data from all of the school data that's available, perhaps noticing that a particular subgroup is not performing as well on an assessment. They may add an interpretation and say, well, that group is not really capable of challenging work. That may sort of hit you wrong in thinking that, well, there's a lot of interpretations that could have been drawn from that same data. They may draw a conclusion that the group needs to be held separate and suggest an action that there be a lower tracked class. If you've got the ladder of inference that everyone on your team is using, you can kind of in a lighthearted way say, hey, when you made that suggestion about creating a lower track, where were you on the ladder of inference? And just sort of ask them to walk you through their thinking. And you know that your team is really embracing this tool when you find people catching themselves and being like, oh, whoa, I'm high on my ladder of inference. Let me walk down and take you through my thinking, and let's look at the evidence together. So this real focus on how.
So any thoughts on that? And how do you think maybe becoming more aware of the unconscious brain and processing in face-to-face communication, do you think this might be helpful for pre-service and induction teachers? Is this something that maybe, do you think they're already aware of it, or is this might be something we should maybe bringing to the surface?
I think it's helpful for pre-service and induction teachers to stop and think about, particularly sometimes their unconscious biases that they have in their how their experience might influence their decisions, because I think we live in a society where we're so quick to move to a quick decision, and and sometimes by not taking that time to really think about multiple alternatives, we miss out on some of the more ideal solutions that are more inclusive.
What I liked about this ladder is that it's actually, again, we tell people, you know, listen, be good listeners, you know, do these skills, but how do you actually do that? You know, what should you, whereas this kind of has a step and a tier that actually you can stop and go, okay, it's something tangible. It's like kind of like, you know, go out and be a good baseball player. Well, what steps do I need to take to be a good baseball player? It's the same thing with our mental processes and with our social emotional skills and with anything we do. We have to cognitively make the effort. We have to bring it to the forefront and go through steps. And that was one thing. And we'll actually show you the tool belt that we use with in the Rutgers program, but to actually deconstruct a simple step of active listening and deconstruct that down into 3 or 4 simple steps that actually encourage you to do that. And it's actually practicing and modeling. And that's what we did in the class, is the instructors actually modeled it for us. And then they had here they are, all educators practicing this. And we all found it to be very helpful. And it kind of empowered us to feel like we really can develop a lot of these skills, which ultimately leads to, I think, which is part of growth mindset. So let's focus on developing. So now that we know kind of some ideas going on with what can be a challenge in effective communication, we need to kind of start focusing on developing effective communication. And I really like the 3 points that were addressed in the great courses. I mean, I'm all for simple and straightforward, but I thought about all 3 really and reflected and thought, there's probably more that could be added, but these 3 really do address a lot of how when you walk away from a conversation that you feel okay about, and when you walk away from a conversation you don't feel okay about. And what would effective face-to-face communication include? 3 basic points. Each person has a moment of positive emotional connection or tangible result. That doesn't mean they agree. That doesn't mean that each doesn't have their own opinion and their own thoughts, but it's that they have made this emotional connection. There's at least a bit of respect, and then I'm listening to what you're saying. And each person is understood from our point of view based on what was communicated back to us. So I'm speaking, and then you're either asking questions about it or following up or asking clarification. And lastly, each person feels the other party seems fine with the exchange, and there were no indications of something not clear or negative emotions. Again, this does not involve not agreeing with someone or having a different opinion, but it does involve the opportunity for us to respect that we can have differences of opinions, appreciate that each person is unique and has their own thoughts, but that ultimately we walked away feeling like at least both of us heard what the other person was saying. And, I thought about this a lot when you relate to students, and particularly, dealing with students. So many times, especially teenagers, middle school and high school, they'll say they're not being heard. And you kind of go, well, okay, what is going on here? Well, part of it probably is that the message coming back isn't telling them they're being heard. The questions being asked or the reaction of the person is indicating they're not being heard. It doesn't mean a teacher has to agree with what's being said, but it does give a student an opportunity to feel like they are heard, which at least builds a foundation for moving forward. And, like restorative justice talks a lot about this and so forth. So as we want to continue having a growth mindset in really addressing working with others, a big part is starting to be aware of how we think and becoming aware of our brain processes when we are conversing with others. Consider the ladder of inference. How high up are you? I really love, there was another video that this instructor does, and there's a whole team in a PLC, and they're looking at data and they're going, these students are struggling, and they immediately start going, that's because they're not listening, they're not coming to, and they stop and go, we've gone way up the ladder. Let's back it up and let's go back and look at the data again. And I really thought about my own experiences in PLC. And, I remember one time we were in there and we were going over it, and we were trying to figure out why students were struggling. I finally decided I'm going to talk to my students, really heard what they said. And I came back and said, you know what? Our questions on our test that the district had us, one of the questions led to misconceptions. They assume that this only happens when this happens, because that's the correlation. And we haven't given in full context of what this even means. And it was the opportunity for all of us to be reflective and not just assume, well, students didn't study, they didn't do this. And the same is true for a peer, and when you're working with them, or when an administrator is giving you feedback, am I immediately assuming all these things because the feedback might have not been first what I expected? And being very clear of identifying your triggers. We all have them, different sounds, different actions, different setups. You know, if you're a very extremely organized person and somebody maybe, you know, organized, but in their own way, that might be just that trigger enough for you to kind of start shutting down and not listening to them. Perception versus fact, that's another big one. And again, it depends on where it is on that ladder. Consider your self-talk, which is a lot of what Elizabeth talked about in January, you know, and not to take things always personally, you know, maybe put that filter down. You know, Stephen Christian talks a lot about the affective filter for linguistical learning and second ESL students. But, you know, every time I heard that, I thought that's true for any person anywhere. We have these screens we put down, and once we feel safe, down go the screens, and we're more willing to take risks with people. Another one is consider how you might be labeling something or someone based on fast brain processing. Again, we say we don't want to have implicit bias in our teachers, and we talk about that, but how do they go about doing that? How can they take those experiences and not just immediately start looking at patterns and jumping to conclusions? Reflect on nonverbal cues, arms crossed, facial expressions. I don't know. Have you ever talked to somebody that even though they haven't said anything negative, they're looking at you and just what's coming back is not making you feel like you're being listened to. You're like, oh, I don't think this is going well. And there are people that do that. You know, they don't feel comfortable verbalizing their comments, but they can't hide or their frustration, but they still show it in their actions or in their facial expressions. And consider social context. And, you know, that again was what a lot of what Dr. Kirkpatrick talked about in the February MTPD on culturally relevant practices. That's what Hammond talks about throughout her book. And if you haven't read that book, we did a book study last summer on it. And I mean, I'm not an expert. In my graduate program, we had culture responsive teaching. We had a whole semester almost on it. And I still walked away not being, needing to learn so much because there's so much depth to it. But one thing that book kept referring back to is a lot of what we're talking about today, and understanding the context and understanding the culture, and that we all don't communicate the same way, and that some are more storytelling in format, some are more bulleted, all, you know, in cultures and the way we communicate. And so that's definitely something to think about. And lastly, about asking questions, I've had people say, well, I don't like people asking me questions. I feel like I'm being interrogated. Well, that's true. There's a way to ask and to find out and to encourage without you feeling like, hi, I'm the teacher, you're the student, when you're working with your peers. So you just kind of work through that. And of course, when you're also referring to the social emotional skills, a big one that Kassel talks about, and actually Rutgers said is the foundation for social emotional learning, is empathy. And empathy and sympathy are not the same thing. Having empathy, having empathy for someone is just understanding that I have not lived your life. I have not lived your experiences. I'm a very different person. I have different views. I've had, and also, and actually the one pager attached to this from step one is a video on there about not what's wrong with that person, but what happened to that person. And it's a great video, and I highly recommend, because it's in the one pager that we'll talk about in a second, that you show it in step one. I've shown it every semester, and my students are always like, oh, you can almost see them kind of thinking. You can see the processes just going, them really reflecting on how many times do I just react the way I see somebody act just now in this isolated situation, but I don't ever really stop and think about why are they doing that? What might be the story behind that? Another one is, again, active listening. Self-reflection. Now, we do quite a bit of self-reflection in step one and throughout the UTeach program, but a lot of it is, on, okay, what can I do better? But self-reflecting on your emotional management. We may have emotions, but that doesn't mean we need to act on them. That's a big one to teach young students as well. and appreciating diversity. Again, that's a huge topic that really, in all honesty, when you start delving into it, should probably be done more in the 3-hour courses and so forth. But even in the STEP classes, we do a simple activity that just appreciation and diversity of thought. And it's a fun activity, and they just come together and they're on a deserted island and they have to talk about the different skills they have. And I mean, we have had so much fun with that activity, but it was amazing. You find out, how students have different skills and the different life experiences, and they really connect again. They all start sharing even more. And it's almost like they're kind of forming a community, which is one that ultimately helps our program, but also helps them with their skill sets. And I know Ken, which the step 3 presentation was fantastic. You mentioned about you really enjoyed that class too, because you're continuing to build on cooperative learning, which all these skills are needed for. And again, when we ask teachers to be in PLCs and do lesson preparation and student support, all this is together. Because, having been in a teaming situation, I was the PLC leader, and when you have a team that really feels strong, even if you are having a challenging year, you have a challenging class, to know that others are caring for you and support you. And, so when you can be honest and say, I'm struggling with a student, perhaps, do you have any advice? And for them to actually go, well, let's look at some solutions. Let's talk about this, versus how many times, if you're a new teacher and you open up and somebody goes, well, I have that student and I never have any problems, that's going to lock that new teacher up immediately. They're not going to feel comfortable sharing. And so these are the just one little statement, and it might not have been meant that way. So you've got to go through that inference. And so that new teacher, if they're going through that ladder of inference, might go, okay, I'm going to have to think through this. Well, let me ask you, what are you doing with that student? So maybe the person made that broad statement that could be taken like, well, I've got my act together, you don't. You stop and go, okay, how can I make this more effective? I also have in here a little bit about empathetic dialogue. It talks about that because you do have to be realistic. Sometimes there is communication breakdown. One, just like we tell people, don't send the email, back away from the keyboard, we'll back away from talking. Same thing, it's just the reality. We're all going to have those days. It just does. But take a breath. Make sure you're not having your cortisol levels just shoot up, step away. And then when you feel comfortable enough, go back and say, hey, when this happened, this is what I felt. Avoid you statements. Don't over talk, don't raise your voice, and stay on topic. Don't pile on. And that's a big one, especially when you're working with students as well. Don't go, well, last assignment, you didn't do this. And this assignment, you didn't do this. Really not doing that. That's not going to help them, because ultimately we really want our students to have a growth mindset. And if they just feel like I failed, it's going to really be hard to overcome that. And the big thing is to always discuss solutions. So this is what we're currently doing in UTeach Dallas. We're talking about, we focused on what skills are needed for them to be successful in their teamwork, and we're actually putting these into the lesson. Even in our lesson plan, we have, what social emotional skill will you be modeling for the students? And not for the students, the elementary school, to do it, but for our UTeach students. And they'll put active listening, and they have to list in detail, what are they going to do? And they may say, I'm turning to my partner as they're speaking, and I'm recognizing them. So they're really consciously thinking about what they're doing. And the same is true when they're collaborating. So, these are, and then in the book of the Handbook of Social Emotional Learning even mentions it. It says in pre-service programs can add SEL into their curriculum through classroom-based videos, role-playing, and out-of-class mentorships. And we're going to talk about, Emily Hennessy and I will be talking about building better or respectful relationships. We actually have started an actual lesson where the students have conversation before they actually teach LP1. They go out and do an active observation where they have a conversation with students, and that we ask them, pick a subject or topic like how, science or math, or do you like it? Do you like this topic? And just how do they converse? And overall, this last spring was the first time we did this lesson, and it was really well received. received. I mean, the students had, our UTeachers, as we call them, had a great time just getting to know the elementary school. They said they felt a connection and they felt less nervous teaching LP1. Just FYI, here's some resources for that CTL Award, Center for Teaching and Learning. These are the resources that we used. Along with the link is the lessons that we did were from 2 statistics professors. They said they wrote a guide to incorporating SEL in college classroom, busting anxiety and boosting ability, because they had so many students stressed out about taking statistics. So, I mean, and when they really, we called them, and Emily and I spoke with them, and they said, oh yes, you can always use our stuff and just share it, just, give them credit, which they did a great job with. And we used 6 of these activities, and these could easily be done in a step 1, just for a fun activity. And they actually really enjoyed it. And the freshman leaders have said the activities really encouraged a good conversation, and everybody felt very comfortable because, so anyways, so you just never know where you're going to get the great resources from. This was an article about social emotional learning is the rage in K through 12. Why not in college? And here's the resource from them. This is the resource that we use for modeling. Again, actually practicing and using modeling on active listening. And Emily and I actually do this in our step 1 classes. We first kind of model it for them. We have a little video, and we've been working on making different videos. And then we have the students. We go through this with the students before they go in their groups. And here is the infamous 1-pager, and many thanks to Elizabeth Goldberg and Dr. Kirkpatrick. We have been in the PD work group, and this last, in 2021, we kind of found all sorts of resources and activities related to social emotional learning that help build equity and address racial equity and racial and social justice. And this is attached here, but I highly recommend looking at it. I mean, there's several good things that could easily be added into the SEL, into step 1 planning, which is what our mindset was. Not something taught outside of step 1, but actually incorporated and smoothly into step 1 as they work together. So there's several activities and really good videos. There's one done by a student. She's like 15, and it's about be here now. And it basically, she became aware that she was not actively listening. And before I did, when I was doing my practicum, I started with what is active listening? And I asked my students, so many of them said active listening is making sure you're taking good notes from your professor to get good grades. I was like, okay. And so I was like, okay, well, that's a good thing, but there's more to it than that. After they watched that video, I mean, the same students were like, well, active listening means being there for other people too, and really listening to people. And it goes beyond just getting good grades. So it was just really insightful, and they learned a lot in, a very short amount of time. So it was very beneficial. This is what currently the importance of social emotional development for in-service teachers. Here's simplest and quickest strategy for improving student behavior and staff performance is effective communication. I really like this one. SEL supports adults to strengthen practices that promote equity. Again, great opportunities. And I've read several articles, again, as I mentioned, about ACID recently, that when a teacher feels like they're part of a team and they feel supported and they feel encouraged and they feel like if they're facing challenges, the people on their team are there for them, they're more likely to stay at a school. And teacher retention is a big issue right now. And I've had friends that are principals and working as in leadership all over the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And it's not just, teachers in high need schools are having these issues. They are having them in all the schools and facing some challenges. So good social emotional support and encouragement and being aware of supportive conversation will help teachers at all levels, no matter where they teach. This is currently what we're doing in Induction right now. I just thought I'd share that. Last summer, we did the culturally responsive practices. This summer, We're doing a book study on the heart and science of teaching. It's very easy read, but has tons of resources. And, you know, we've reached out for alumni chats, check-ins, and we're constantly just trying to connect with our induction, because one thing they do say is UTeach really providing that induction support makes a big difference to them. Here's a good resource if you want to do a book study on culturally responsive teaching in the brain. You can go to this website, and it's a great study guide. I used it, believe me, because I was like a couple of pages ahead of the group when I was leading it. So I did not feel like an expert, and I use this a lot and very insightful. Our group that attended that book study said they really felt like it helped them a lot. And here is the tool, we call it the tool belt and as you can see, it kind of goes through different like emotional regulation, or you might do one on social awareness. You might do one on working on not being judgmental. How do you mentally go through those steps? And that's what you would list here. And when teachers actually write them down, each one has a different strategy, but when they write them down and then they realize, okay, this is something I can do, because it's kind of like goal setting. And then they mentally kind of go through that process. It really is helpful. And we had to use it for that course. And I found it to be very successful, because if a teacher sees the value of social emotional skills for themselves and working on developing themselves, it's just naturally going to come out in their classes, working with others. They're going to value it. They're going to see the importance of it, and ultimately model it just naturally in a class, no matter what they're teaching. And none of this needs to be done outside of curriculum. It can all be incorporated into curriculum. So, and this is where we're hoping to go. And, you know, any ideas or anybody that would like to continue in this area and continue to share ideas and to help kind of add more of this in, because I know Elizabeth is looking into a one-pager for step 2 and CI. We'd love to, you know, to get ideas, but addressing mental processes and brain research, building a growth mindset for social emotional skill development, building a growth mindset for identifying brain processes when communicating with others and thinking through them, modeling SEL skills. And there's actually a big article I've attached to here from ACID about how do we actually also teach our own students to have good conversation, not presentation skills, just conversation, to create a safe, nurturing, encouraging environment that's going to allow students to feel safe to take academic risks. Deepening our understanding of 21st century skills and continuing education. And this is the article, and that's pretty much what I've got. And I'd love to hear anything anyone else, you know, watching the video has, or if you all have something to share today, because this is a very growing, it's dynamic. And, you know, I'm open to any and all ideas, and the more we can learn from one another, which is what makes MTPDs wonderful, the better. And thank you again, Elizabeth, for giving us the opportunity to learn from one another and to see what great things everybody's doing.
Where in the step 1 course sequence do you fit some of these lessons in?
Well, for example, we actually have one lesson where we just focus on cooperative learning, and we actually model an activity, and we give them each a duty, and they have to read about it. And then they have to stop and reflect on their own duty and the importance of it, because a lot of times they just give each other duties and then they don't ever follow up with them or see the importance of them. So then they have to stop and pick someone else's duty and think about, what would that entail? What kind of skill sets would that need? You know, what kind of burden might that be on someone with a very heavy schedule? So they kind of have to stop and really think, if they were the teacher, and think through that. But then also think about if they were a team having to work together, kind of helping form that empathy. So we do that. We have a norms contract when they actually start working together, and they work and they actually decide on what each person's duty is going to be, but then the value of it and balancing it out. We talk about, only takes us a few minutes for the active listening. One of the videos is less than 5 minutes. So we put that in pretty early on. Then as we're going through, we have a whole lesson on growth mindset and differentiated instruction. And that's when we talk about diversity of thought. And this one activity only takes about 20, 25 minutes, maybe I'd say 20. And it's just on, it really is, it's just a fun one. And they talk about their different skill sets and what they could bring. And when we ask them, so apply this to a classroom, they kind of talk about, well, it makes you aware that everybody may have skills that they're not even realizing they have. So that's where we're kind of incorporating it. And in our lesson plans, we actually have them write what social emotional skills the students are going to model for the elementary school, and how would I know they are modeling that? What exactly in their mind would they be doing? Like if they're going to collaborate, they'll say, I'll introduce the team. Each team player will take a section of the lesson and present, and will respond back, and will enhance what the other person has said. So they're doing things like that. So they're consciously thinking about working as a team throughout their like lesson presentations.
Okay, good.
So it's not taking a lot of time, because yeah, that's the biggest issue, is that, and because we want to model for them what we would love to see them do one day in their own STEM classes. Because in a STEM class, you don't have an entire class period to go over social emotional skills. But if you just continue to weave them in, the other thing we do every week is we have an SEL objective. Like today, we will be focusing on constructive feedback, what that looks like. And we'll give like a little brief reminder of what this is. This isn't being judgmental. This is us supporting one another, trying to encourage us to get stronger in lessons, that type of thing. So putting it as an objective also brings it to the surface.
Yeah, and I guess that's what I'm struggling with is fitting into my classes, because I think sometimes I have assumed that I was communicating by modeling things, but I think without that explicit focus, they don't sometimes pick up on the modeling part.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's true of all of us. That's why it was actually, I was talking to a peer, another master teacher, and she said, by putting it on there, it brings, and it reminds me to also, because you get teaching and you get going and you've got a million things to do. It also reminds me to bring it up and really think about it and remind them what this looks like.